Good morning and welcome to Outsiders, the show that is to woke virtue signalling and identity politics what Humphrey Bogart was to ham acting and slapstick pantomime.
But what about us?
We'll always have Paris.
We've got a Casablanca of a show for you today with star of the silver screen, Rita Panahi.
Here's looking at you, kid.
And suave man about town, James Morrow.
Of all the gin joints in all the town, she walks into mine.
And with myself, Rowan Victor Laszlo Dean. If we stop breathing, we'll die. We stop fighting our enemies, the world will die. But is it true? Will we always have Paris? Doesn't look like it. Certainly not the free-loving Paris I spent part of my childhood in. This week we saw the French police checking the vaccine passports of ordinary people going about their daily business, doing what the French love to do best, idling away a few lazy hours in a Saint-Germain cafe. Not any longer. Now the gendarmerie are busy checking your vaccine passports right across France.
Je vais contrôler vos passes sanitaires, s'il vous plaît.
Voilà.
Avec une pièce d'identité, s'il vous plaît.
Still, the French do have a long and checkered history of checking people's papers.
May we see your papers?
I don't think I have them on me.
In that case, we'll have to ask you to come along.
Wait, it's possible that yes. Here they are.
These papers expired 3 weeks ago. You'll have to come along.
That is, of course, from Casablanca, and again, to paraphrase Humphrey Bogart, it doesn't take much to see that the problems of the little people don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world. He was presumably talking about Australia in 2021, where the problems of the small business people, the shop owners and cafe owners trying to feed their families in Western Sydney and elsewhere, the grey nomads made refugees in their own land, the everyday Aussies battling to earn a crust, certainly do not amount to a hill of beans as far as the premiers are concerned in crazy old Australia, as we reveal in Outsiders News. Well, James and Rita, Gladys has declared war on COVID, or has she declared war on the people of New South Wales? Have a listen to her Police Commissioner, Mick Fuller.
The New South Wales Police Force will launch Operation Stay at Home Sunday at midnight. New South Wales Police will be supported by the Australian Defence Force. As you know, there are already 300 men and women of the ADF on the ground, and an additional 500 will come online from Monday. There's a whole range of other health orders that we can use against you. I closed the first business this morning, a cafeteria at Leichhardt, for 14 days for continual breaches of the health order, and I won't apologise that more businesses will be closed over the next 21 days. There are 1,400 men and women in the New South Wales Highway Patrol who now will be dedicated to COVID compliance duties on our roads. You would have seen roadblocks both south and north over the last couple of days, and across Greater Sydney and into regional New South Wales. Expect to see more roadblocks where we'll be checking with compliance.
James, this is tyranny. This is disgusting. The rest of the world is laughing at us. I cannot believe that a police commissioner does not care about the jobs he is destroying and the lives he is destroying. James?
Well, I'll tell you what, Rowan, I think I'd like to propose a new motto for New South Wales. Beatings will continue until morale improves, or maybe beatings will continue until the COVID numbers hit zero. Yesterday, Gladys Berejiklian at her press conference said that this was the darkest day of the pandemic. She was referring to case numbers, but I think that there is also a case to be made that it was a dark day because this was the day that the government, as I predicted and said 4 or 5 weeks ago on this program, had both lost control of the pandemic, but also lost control of the political response to this. I want to quote what Gladys Berejiklian said in the press conference. She said, quote, I just want to assure the community that not only will the police commissioner receive what he wants in terms of additional powers or additional resources, but more than what he needs and wants. What Gladys Berejiklian said there, and she said it over and over again in the press conference when it was about things like the singles bubble, where you will now need to register your intimate partner with the government if you are in one of those bubbles, where it is now about 5 kilometers versus 10 kilometers, where there are restrictions on outdoor activities, even though she said herself there's really no evidence that outdoors is at all dangerous. All of this, she said, was about making it easier for the police, not about controlling the coronavirus, which is absolutely important. But what she's talking about doing now isn't about controlling the coronavirus. It is about simply control of the people. And she has lost control, I think, of the government here, because what I am told and what the tea leaves suggest to me is that Kerry Chant, there was a lot of talk that the chief health officer was, looking to quit because she was unhappy with the response. So, as a result of that, Gladys Berejiklian caved and said, all right, well, now we're just going to go really hard with the enforcement. But that's not medically or scientifically sound. People are very sympathetic to doing what they're supposed to do because of health advice. But if it's about enforcement and giving the police more powers, that means that people are going to be a lot less likely to comply. And ironically, this is going to wind up causing a lot more scofflaw behavior, I think, than it will actually wind up leading to compliance and a bringing down of case numbers.
Rita, let's go through these fines. A $5,000 fine for breaches of home quarantine, $5,000 on-the-spot fines, $3,000 on-the-spot fines. Rita, a $5,000 fine to a person could crush them and their family for months to come, destroy their business, destroy their life. I cannot believe this.
Well, these crippling fines are being announced just when people can least afford them. And $3,000 on-the-spot fine for breaching the 2-person exercise rule. Does that seem proportionate to you? It's a police state. And then the Premier is quite open about following the advice of the police as opposed to supposedly the best medical advice. So it's all about making enforcement easier for the constabulary than actually what's possibly in the best interests of New South Wales. And I can tell you in Victoria here, we're being told now that our current lockdown, which has already been extended once, is likely to be extended again, possibly into September. And remember, Premier Dan Andrews told us you only get one chance to lock down hard, lock down early. That's what Victoria did. But the case numbers aren't diminishing. They're sticking around the same level when we went into lockdown. And so we're going to be in lockdown for some time as well. And I think that's an important note to remember, because with this Delta variant, it is far more infectious. And this notion that New South Wales can get to a COVID zero by just being tougher, I think is just naive.
Well, James, we heard this half-wit Mark McGowan talking to Andrew Clennell earlier, saying he believes he's God, he believes he can get to zero COVID, and he's slamming the borders shut. It's what happens, James? Rita quite rightly says that this is the Delta version is contagious. What happens when the next one, the Kylie version, comes along and it's even more contagious, and we suddenly have 800 people a day rather than 400? In New South Wales, are we going to be slamming $10,000 fines on people, then $20,000 fines on people? We are in a cycle of tyranny that is a disgrace for this country, James.
And I'll tell you what, for as much as we can criticize Gladys Berejiklian here, Mark McGowan is absolutely the worst premier in the country, and he confirmed that just a little while ago on this network. He told Andrew Clennell, political editor of Sky News Australia, that they don't expect to hit 80% until sometime next year. Now, WA's vaccination program is well behind all the other states, and he said that even once you hit 80%, that the goal should still be zero COVID elimination. Now, I can't think of a better way to encourage vaccine hesitancy than to tell people that getting vaccinated ultimately doesn't matter because you will still be in the endless cycle of lockdowns and restrictions that the jab is supposed to get us out of, that is supposed to be part of the national agreement. And this also shows, of course, the great weakness of the national cabinet, which we've talked about a lot on this program, and, of course, that 4-phase program that the Prime Minister came up with to get us out of the pandemic because, of course, the issue, as I have said since the very start, is that, well, any state that doesn't want to play ball and wants to handbrake the country can do so. So, Mark McGowan, take a bow. Congratulations. You're cracking up the Federation. Well done. I hope you're proud of yourself.
Rita and James, we've talked about the cruelty to businesses, which is crippling, and to livelihoods. But the human cruelty going on in the name of COVID is just sickening. As I said, the rest of the world is looking at us in horror. We should hang our heads in shame. But Rita and James, talk us through a couple of the worst examples. For example, in Queensland, Anastasia Palaszczuk, of cruelty under the name of COVID. James.
Oh, well, I mean, there are so many different examples of it. We see all of the businesses that are being fined. We see more and more people being told that they cannot go to funerals. We had this case of this baby who died in this horrible incident with this magpie, and Queensland is denying them an exemption for a funeral for an infant because that could be some sort of COVID super spreading event. Now, you know, this is the other bit of this. They're supposed to be saying, as part of the Doherty Institute plan and the national plan, that test, trace, isolate, and quarantine will still be needed after 80% because you still want to isolate cases in people who have COVID. But if these states at this point cannot, consider even the possibility of dealing with COVID from one funeral for one infant and tracing and testing around that, they have no hope when we actually open up the country at 80%. This is the great weakness of the whole program.
Rita?
I just scoffed at that because Mark McGowan might be a clown, but at least he's an honest clown. I think the notion that we're going to open up at 80% vaccinated is, again, naive.
Fanciful, yeah.
Mark McGowan may be the only one who's putting it out there, but I can tell you there are other premiers, including Liberal premiers like that Marshmallow Man in South Australia, here in Victoria, who are already making noises about above 80%. We still need to have restrictions when there's an outbreak. So this lockdown mentality, this one solution to all problems, I don't think is going to go away at 80% vaccinated. We need a fundamental shift in our mindset and our attitude to this virus and learning to live with it once our vaccination rate is higher, because we are so far from that. The rest of the world is in an advanced position to us as far as it understanding that this virus is endemic. It will always be around. There'll be new strains, there'll be new challenges, but you don't shut down society to deal with one virus.
And Rita, you mentioned the clown in South Australia. Our athletes have to do an extra quarantine, and so it goes on. We've had that, which I would have thought was a fairly unusual punishment to inflict upon them. Rita, you've also got a really distressing story from overseas about COVID cruelty.
I think you're talking about the young child who was forced to undergo a COVID test before boarding a plane. This is a British child. I think his name's Callum. He's a young teenager. He's autistic. He's on the spectrum, and his parents had an exemption letter from his doctor saying that he shouldn't have to undergo a COVID test because he doesn't cope with that ordeal very well. Well, the airline, Ryanair, didn't care about that. They made sure that he had the test before he was allowed to join his family on the flight. Let's have a look at the footage. It is a bit distressing.
Well, you put it right this time. I put it right there. You prefer this one?
A child with ADHD and autism
We're not in the
refused Ryanair flight,
okay?
even with GP
You prefer
letter
this one?
stating exemption. not good enough for Ryanair
Is it this one only?
This is what has to happen to get on a Ryanair flight.
Dile que pase, Joan. Ya ambas es que no sabe hablar inglés. Si me
A child with autism and ADHD.
Okay, mate. A ver, dile que no se preocupe, que vamos a hacerlo en el mismo.
Take it easy, okay? It's just 1 second, okay? You have to be still, okay? Otherwise it will take longer.
Come on then, quickly, last chance. Go, go, do it. You're the man, you're the man.
Yeah.
You're the man, you're the man, you're the man, you're the man, you're the man.
You're right, Rita, it's distressing, but people need to see how distressing it is because that is the result of draconian authoritarianism at every level. Once our leaders sacrifice humanity, once our leaders decide that the rules and the police must have full authority and you've got to abide by this rule and you've got to abide by that law and you must do this because it's in the public good, that is what you end up with. You people are a disgrace, you premiers are a disgrace, and your national cabinet is an absolute disgrace. What has happened to the Australia I was born in and grew up in? Now, we have Dan Andrews threatening the same. We heard the police commissioner threatening people's livelihoods. We've had Dan Andrews threatening vaccine passports are on the way, despite the fact that around the world there are riots in the streets against vaccine passports. Have a listen to Dan Andrews.
There will come a time, though, where I think restrictions will apply to those who have not been vaccinated, rather than restrictions applying to all of us. Now, if that's not an incentive to go and get vaccinated, I don't know what is. But I can see a time when to get into a venue, to attend a major event, to participate fully.
Let me tell you, the only incentive here is to vote every one of these idiots out at the next election. That's the incentive to the people of Australia. How cruel can you be? Rita, restaurateurs being deliberately tackled with fines because they dared to speak up against the Victorian Premier. Is that right? Or am I reading something into it?
Well, it could be a wild coincidence. We don't know if it was targeted, but it is interesting that two most vocal critics of the Dan Andrews COVID response in the hospitality sector, Chris Lucas and Paul Diamantina, both you would have seen on this station a number of times, both fined in the first hours of lockdown 6. And we're not talking about a small fine here, we're talking about $10,900 fines. In Chris Lucas's case, he had a few people still inside his premises at 8 p.m. waiting for Ubers and taxis to collect them. Fine. And Paul Diamantina, again, he was also closed down, but he had a couple of family members, and I think his business partner consoling him inside the premises. So fine. I just find that to be, again, at a time when this sector can least afford these big fat fines, they are getting targeted, and the two most vocal critics cop fines within hours of each other.
Yeah, and it doesn't stop there, Rita. The Victorian government, on a separate note, nothing to do with COVID, but they're allowing camping on 27 river frontages in northern Victoria that are currently licensed to farmers. There's been a lot of people upset about that for the obvious reason. This is socialism putting its hand in and taking people's private property. But also, we've seen the outrage going on the border. Joining us now is the Victorian MP for Polwarth, Richard Reardon, with his own story about what's been happening on the border. Great to see you, Richard. How are you?
Well, thanks, Rowan. Really good. Yes, we've got this situation where Australia now has lost so much humanity, so much common sense, that we've got literally thousands. The health minister said yesterday 12,000, and I'm guessing it's at least twice that. Victorians who travel north every year, whether it's North Coast, New South Wales or into Queensland, in their caravans, elderly people by and large, who generally take 2 or 3 days to drive back to Victoria, are now essentially being prevented from returning home. Now, this is in a time, in a world where we can put people in the moon, we can put Elon Musk's cars into space, but for some reason in this COVID pandemic, we haven't got enough common sense to have some sort of regime where people can come back to the border, be tested, if they're clear, safely travel across the border and back home where they rightfully belong. It's insanity, Rowan.
Rita.
And these people are often elderly and have some medical issues. So are they getting the medical care they need whilst they're in this no man's land and unable to return to their own homes?
No, they're not, Rita. They're currently in almost makeshift refugee camps in caravan parks from one end of New South Wales to the top of Queensland. and it is absolutely insane. Many, many Victorians, with particularly older people with health conditions, will head north to be warm over summer, but they make their doctor's appointments for late August, September, October in order to come home. They're not giving any exemptions for that type of return. And in fact, more distressingly, I've got one grandparent whose son's been diagnosed with a serious cancer on the brink of dying. They're one of the primary carers for the boy. And they fill in the forms to say we want to come back to our own home in the country Australia. I mean, returning to your own home in Australia, most people certainly never go to a poll to say we're going to take that right away from people. They're then sent a form they've got to fill in. This is for someone who's going to die. End-of-life event is their exemption they want. And they've got to provide a prognosis of the person at end of life. Now, what sort of health department is so clueless that they're wanting to know what the prognosis is for someone who's going to die? I mean, heavens above, that's how ridiculous the bureaucracy's become in Victoria. I mean, Daniel Andrews needs to come out and tell those thousands and thousands of people what his plan is to get them back to Victoria in a reasonable time and in a safe and a way that all Victorians can support. But telling people, as Martin Foley did yesterday, that they are stuck for the indefinite period of time in no man's land is just insanity writ large.
James.
Putting aside the moral dubiousness and constitutional dubiousness of not allowing people to cross state borders in their own country, what risk do the authorities think that these travelers pose? I mean, these are people who will have been in Queensland, they will have been in places in New South Wales that have absolutely no coronavirus or have had none for weeks, if not months. They're elderly, so statistically they're much more likely to be vaccinated than anybody else. These people are not coming from Campbelltown in Sydney or someplace like that. What on earth is the Victorian government's problem here?
Look, Daniel Andrews, time and time again, loves to make himself look like the fit man, the tough man. And what he does is he is prepared to ruthlessly strip all sorts of people from their rights, whether they're small business people, and we've seen time and time again, tourism, hospitality, gym operators, florists, events industry. He is happy to just burn the rights and fortunes of these people with no plan to do something to help support them. It's just not good enough. And you know, this fits on top of our elderly here in Victoria who've been in nursing homes. They have been locked down for over 300 days. Most criminals don't get 300 days of solitary confinement. And this is an issue. We've got our elderly in nursing homes. We've got our baby boomers stuck in New South Wales and Queensland. There are people suffering from one end of Victoria to the other. And the worst part is there's just no plan. They are perfectly happy to stand up and say, oh, you know, we've done it for 200 days now, 300 days now. We can do it a bit longer. You know, Daniel Andrews and these health department officials, they're getting paid every week. Their life's pretty much normal. They're not doing anything differently. They're not suffering financially. They're still seeing their family, but they're happy to take those rights from everybody else.
Richard Riordan, great to speak to you. Keep up the passion. Keep fighting for those people on the border, the grey nomads. Great to see some photos of them there. Thanks very much, and we'll chat to you again soon. Thank you.
Good, Rowan. Thanks.
James and Rita, I want to quickly touch as well on Afghanistan, what's been happening there in Afghanistan. You know, it's shocking. We've seen basically, James, a replay of Vietnam in the early 70s. Talk us through it.
Well, shocking scenes out of Afghanistan now, and it's happening right now in real time. Northern Afghanistan, which is arguably strategically more important than Kabul, the capital, is now all gone to the Taliban. Kabul is falling, they say, within the next 72 hours. That is gone to the Taliban. The embassy right now is burning papers. It is like something out of the fall of Vietnam, the fall of Saigon. We are, one step away from the helicopters on the rooftops. Where is Joe Biden in all of this? Well, he's a Camp David. He's a Camp David and will be there until next Wednesday while this great failure of his presidency takes place and unfolds underneath the eyes of the world. Of course, Joe Biden's presidency is beset by problems. The crisis at the southern border, which I'll be speaking about a little bit later in the program, rising inflation, all sorts of other issues that are now besetting America. Of course, the Afghanistan engagement is a great, I think, tragedy for America and really the world. After 9/11, of course, there was a very strong case to go in there, but there's also a very strong case to be made that the original mission of Afghanistan was accomplished in 2002, and that the United States shouldn't have gotten involved in a 20-year-long engagement in a place that nobody else has been able to control or take control of or subdue for decades, if not centuries. I mean, they don't call it the graveyard of empires for nothing. The interesting thing, of course, going forward is now that that Afghanistan opens up a vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does geopolitics. China is looking to become close with the Taliban. I admire their confidence in thinking that they can make pals with the Taliban. But it brought down Russia. It's brought America low. So best of luck, Xi Jinping, to you. But,
I think we should be encouraging Xi Jinping.
Well,
I think go for it. Go. Come on, China. Go on, mate. You can sort it out. Rita.
Yeah.
Rita.
No, I think China's going to capitalise on the West's failures, and the failure there is extraordinary. The human cost, thousands of lives lost, around $1 trillion of money wasted, and the country falls within days, weeks. It is just astonishing, the failure there, and the Biden administration has mishandled this exit, and the president needs to take some ownership and be present. You can't be off at Camp David and doing silly videos for TikTok when this is happening on your watch.
Absolutely. Well, he probably doesn't aware that he's in Camp David. He wouldn't know where he was at any point in time, so we don't have to worry about his schedule. Joining us now is great friend of Outsiders, Calvin Robinson, over in London. Calvin, great to see you. How are you?
Good to see you all. I'm fantastic. Thank you very much for having me back on.
Well, always great to see you. We'll talk a little bit about Britain's freedom and freedom from lockdowns, etc. in a second. But first of all, I loved your tweet where you questioned whether climate change is racist or not, based on the IPCC's latest missive on how we're all going to die or whatever it is. Talk us through your thoughts, Calvin.
I don't even know what to think about it, to be honest. It's that bonkers. It seems to me every day something else is racist. This week it was the climate. But the whole of the newspapers over here this week have been talking about how the end of the world is coming. It's an apocalypse. It's the new emergency. It's the new disaster. COVID's coming to an end. So they need something else to talk about. And it seems to be the climate is the issue. And of course, any issue that comes up these days has to come down to race. How? I don't know how they put 2 and 2 together and made 5, but they did somehow. But I don't know why it's a problem over here, because the UK has been leading the way in CO2 emissions for the last, 45 years? We've reduced them year on year. And for all these extremists that want to change the way we live our lives over here and tax us left, right and centre for the climate, all they need to do is start lobbying China, who use more CO2 emissions than the rest of the world combined.
Absolutely. And they had this nonsense about trying to get everyone to spend £20,000 on a new heating system for their homes, which would mean that they'd freeze during winter. Having lived in London for many winters, let me tell you, you need that gas central heating. You need it, Calvin.
That's what it always comes down to, isn't it? It's always offsetting the taxes and the fees onto the little man, onto the everyday folk at home. We'd have to pay tens of thousands of pounds more for these ridiculous green boilers, while our leaders, the elite, are still able to jet around the world in their private jets, in their charter flights, without having to pay any taxes on them, because they are exempt. The EU put special laws in place so the elites can swan around as much as they like without feeling guilty, while we are paying tens of thousands of pounds more to reheat our home in a less efficient manner. How is that acceptable? I don't think people are going to buy it. Fortunately, Boris Johnson has made a U-turn on the boiler situation already, but that's just one situation. There are so many other areas of our lives that are being taxed extra for this so-called climate emergency. The cars are another way. We were told for a long time diesel was the way to go, and now it's electric is the way to go. But it doesn't really matter, because the way that they build these cars actually kills more fumes than building a good old-fashioned combustion engine car. So it's all nonsensical, isn't it?
James.
Well, it's funny that you talk about, cost and benefits not being weighed up properly, because isn't that what we've seen here with the COVID response in Britain? And I want to ask you about a story that was in the UK Telegraph that said that ultimately at the end of the day, looks like Sweden got it far more right, which was much maligned, than Britain over the course of the pandemic, saved many more lives, preserved many more freedoms. And can you speak to that and also tell us how things are going in London with the pandemic now that you've hit Freedom Day? Is it just death and chaos in the street, or are people getting on with their lives?
People are thankfully getting on with their lives. I've seen fewer and fewer masks. I know, thank you. People are just going about their normal day-to-day routines. There are a few people still wearing masks or these comfort blankets over their faces to make themselves feel better on the London Underground. But apart from that, people are going to work, or most people are going to work. There are still a few shy people staying at home and working from home. But I think the problem we have is that the government spent so much money, millions and millions of pounds, convincing us all that this was, the disaster to end all disasters. And they put Project Fear down into all of us so that people are convinced that they should be anxious, they should stay at home, they should wear a mask, they should, give away all their freedoms. And now people are going to need some help to come back to normality. The government's going to have to spend some money to reverse Project Fear, if you ask me. I don't know if they are going to do that, but they should do something.
Stockholm Syndrome. Rita.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned Boris Johnson doing a bit of a U-turn on gas heaters, but the Prime Minister over there seems to have embraced this green lunacy and is pushing ahead. So what's the situation there? Is there any one opposing this push? Because we know Labor are even greener than Boris. Who's the opposition there?
Rita, that is the key question I've been asking myself for the past 18 months. Where is the opposition? The Labour Party, the opposition party, have been backing the government in every step of the way. They've been saying, we need tougher restrictions, longer restrictions. The Lib Dems, the Green Party, are, of course, backing these green policies that the government's coming out with. So there's no one to oppose anything the government does. They get away with anything. At this point, they don't even have parliamentary debate around a lot of the new legislation. They just shove things through under the COVID regulations, this emergency power that the government's given itself. And, of course, let's not forget the Prime Minister's, I was going to say girlfriend, but the Prime Minister's new wife is at the forefront of a lot of these green policies. So we know who's the puppeteer putting the strings, unfortunately. But you're right, there is no opposition. We need some strong opposition over here just to hold the government to account and make sure, keep them honest.
Calvin Robinson, always great to chat to you. Where can people catch you on Twitter?
At Calvin Robinson is the best place.
Fantastic. We urge outsiders to do that. Always great to see you, Calvin. Keep safe, keep well.
My pleasure.
See you, mate. Coming up, we've got Rita's reality check, and we will be chatting later to Ami Horowitz and Michael Schellenberger.
Welcome back to Outsiders. Soon we'll be looking at the latest in the war against women, including some truly disturbing developments from Scotland. And in America, the Academy of Breastfeeding Medicine has deemed their own name outdated, is suggesting terms such as chest feeding and father's milk. Ooh. But first to the UK, where they're woke, Sky News, not like ours, they're very woke over there. They're warning the masses about climate change destroying their sex life.
Climate change is going to affect your sex life. Here's how. Firstly, there's a small matter, literally, of pollution changing our bodies. In fact, boys are being born with smaller penises. It's all because of the chemicals used in manufacturing plastic.
Buckle up, there's more, much more. You see, the Poms are terribly worried about having warmer nights. It's a big problem over there. And you know what warm nights mean? No sex and no babies, apparently.
But here is some bad news. Our sex drives drop when it's hot. In the US, one very warm day led to 1,000 fewer births 9 months later.
But some people can't handle the heat. They're not going to want to be touched. They're not going to want to be bothered.
Yes, they used as their example a 56-degree day in America to prove that a possible 1 degree rise in temperature would see birth rates plummeting. Dear God, it only gets worse.
Back to those plastic chemicals, they're also affecting men's fertility. Some scientists believe most men will be infertile by 2045.
Procreation, only folks look at it as, if I can't produce, then who am I? There's some folks that think like that. But there's also some folks that have had children and can't take care of them. You can still help someone grow into the person that they are meant to be, right? And yes, they may not come from your womb, but you can still be a parent. So I think also even looking at it as, what is a parent to you? Asking those type of questions.
But the climate change catastrophe won't just destroy your sex life and see masses of men become infertile. It will see an explosion in female sea turtles, who will have less male sea turtles to breed with. Stay with me now.
Sea turtles bury their eggs in the sand. The temperature of the sand affects the sex of their children. Cooler sand creates male turtles, so global warming could mean we have too many female turtles. Scientists predict that by 2030, just 2% of hatchlings will be male. Bad news for a lot, and there really will be a lot of female turtles.
My gosh, look at how sad that sea turtle looks. Maybe it's strayed into Australian waters and is about to become a victim of native title hunting, but that's an editorial for another day. Now to another topic that has barely received any coverage in Australia, despite our two biggest cities experiencing prolonged lockdowns during the past 18 months. That issue is immunity debt, one of the many side effects of lockdowns on children. The median age of COVID-19 deaths in Australia is 86, but it will be our children who will pay the highest price in the long run. Their academic and social development has been stunted. They've suffered a surge in serious mental health issues, including a massive increase in suicidal ideation, and we've saddled them with enormous debt, which will take decades to pay off. Among the many harms inflicted on children in the name of COVID safety has been a little phenomenon called immunity debt, where one's immune system does not develop normally against non-COVID viruses due to lockdown measures that result in reduced exposure to people, bacteria and germs. Last month, immunity debt was blamed for a significant jump in the number of children, including desperately ill infants, admitted to hospitals in New Zealand with very serious respiratory conditions, some requiring ICU beds. The Guardian reported New Zealand hospitals are experiencing the payoff of immunity debt created by COVID-19 lockdowns, with wards flooded by babies with a potentially deadly respiratory virus, doctors have warned. Wellington has 46 children currently hospitalised for respiratory illnesses, including respiratory RSV. A number of infants are on oxygen. Other hospitals are also experiencing a rise in cases in New Zealand, and that's straining their resources, with some delaying surgeries or converting playrooms into clinical spaces. The explosion in RSV cases saw 969 cases recorded in a 5-week period in New Zealand, when there are typically around 1,700 cases annually during the winter months. And the outbreak has put considerable strain on a number of hospitals, with some postponing surgeries. Middlemore Hospital's Children's Emergency Department in Auckland experienced its busiest day ever in June, with 140 patients in 24 hours. The surge in sick kids saw the hospital convert a children's playroom into a clinical space. Now, this issue of immunity debt is, of course, not just being discussed in New Zealand. A team of French doctors released a paper in May on the immune debt of COVID-19 pandemic in childhood. The paper concluded that the lack of immune stimulation during lockdowns induces, and I quote, an immunity debt which could have negative consequences when the pandemic is under control. The longer these periods of viral or bacterial low exposure are, the greater the likelihood of future epidemics. This is due to a growing proportion of susceptible people and a declined herd immunity in the population. Putting it more simply is Canadian microbiologist and immunologist Professor Brett Finlay, who said, because of the whole COVID lockdown, kids are being immune deprived and their microbes are being screwed up. So their immune systems are a bit screwed up. Can't get more simple than that explanation. Now, I'm not suggesting that the issue of immunity debt should change the course of COVID measures, but that we must consider that harm along with all the other unintended consequences and harms caused by lockdowns. How can we know the impact of a policy if our focus is so narrow that we do not see beyond COVID numbers? Why aren't we also considering the impact on all other health conditions, from cancer treatments to heart disease to the numbers of dementia deaths and, of course, the impact on mental health. Harvard Medical School professor and infectious disease expert Dr. Martin Kulldorff, who has been critical of lockdown, saying they ultimately do more harm than good, he wrote, "Public health is about all health outcomes, not just a single disease like COVID-19. It is important to also consider harms from public health measures." That's a public health principle our bureaucrats and politicians would do well to remember.
Great. Thanks, Rita. Well, the war on women is the one, this is the only show you'll find people talking about this, the way the militant transgender movement is actually just an old-fashioned war against women. We've talked about Laurel Hubbard, who was the failed Olympian at the Tokyo Games, a transgender woman, which means a man who has changed to a woman. One of the Olympic athletes has spoken out in New Zealand. Her name is Tracy Lambrex, and she was a female weightlifter who in 2017 was gearing up to compete in the 2018 Commonwealth Games when she was informed that if she wished to participate, she would need to change her weight class to make room for Laurel Hubbard. In other words, this woman had to massively change her entire sporting career to make room for this transgender woman, Laurel Hubbard. And she has said, Tracy Lambrex, that we were told not to talk to the media and we were warned that if we did, we would bring the sport into disrepute and that we would miss out on being selected. What an absolute disgrace, James.
Well, it's a complete disgrace, but it just goes to show the way that the left have always sacrificed women on the altar of whatever sort of power game that they're playing. And the latest one, of course, is trans ideology. And so here we see women, and we see this in all sorts of sports. We've talked about this on this show for a long, long time, and we're some of the only people who do. We've talked about this in the United States with college scholarships going to people. We've talked about it in all sorts of contexts. This is important because language matters, and they are trying to rewrite the language and the way that we all talk about these things to one another.
Absolutely.
And it's very, very destructive to actual women.
Very quickly, Rita, before we go to a break. Rita?
Well, I'm with you, and James is right. Women do get sacrificed on this political correctness, and we've seen women living under Islam face that for decades, where the feminist movement pretty much ignored their plight and refused to get involved in that conflict, even supporting hijab laws whilst women are fighting against them. And yeah, we're seeing it now with the radical trans ideology that's being pushed very heavily now.
Well, exactly. And there is a new weightlifter in America, a transgender weightlifter who is causing already all sorts of dramas within the community over there. But let's just remind ourselves of South Park and their take on transgender athletes.
Well, what is an average trans athlete? Honestly, I find that kind of bigoted, David.
Okay. Heather Swanson is actually joining us now. Miss Swanson, how does it feel to be competing today?
I can't tell you how free I feel now that I've started identifying as a woman. Now that I can compete as female, I'm ready to smash the other girls.
That used to be satire. Now it's reality. We'll be back in a tick. You're watching Outsiders with Rita Panahi, James Morrow, and myself, Rowan Dean. And a big thank you from the three of us to you. You gave us the gold medal last week. We were the #1 show on the entire network. Thank you very much. We mean it. Well, ever since this pandemic began, we warned that governments would arm themselves with draconian powers in the name of keeping citizens safe. Tin pot premiers and their army of unelected bureaucrats have never been so powerful. And now it's taken a really sinister turn.
WA enforcing Australia's first ever vaccine passport. requiring travellers from high-risk states to have had at least one jab to get through our hard border.
This hasn't been done before in Australia.
The Premier says the new criteria provides a pathway for West Australians still stuck in New South Wales to come home.
It's an incentive to go and get vaccinated.
If people meet those criteria, then they're much more likely to get approval.
To be clear, we have long urged Australians to get vaccinated against COVID. We have castigated those who have contributed to AstraZeneca hesitancy, such as Queensland's Jeanette Young and the ABC's Norman Swan. But as you saw, even West Australians trying to return home will be shut out unless they are vaccinated. This policy is abhorrent to everything the Australians hold dear. And it's been allowed to happen because one unprincipled and egotistical Premier is drunk on power.
Drones are being deployed in Perth as more activities are banned.
They're the eyes and voices in the sky.
Social distancing is critical.
Like something out of a science fiction movie, but this is our new reality.
These drones will be used at parks and other places where people congregate. There is a clear message to any interstater thinking about coming to Western Australia. Don't come. We don't want you here. If you're an Eastern stater and thinking about visiting Western Australia, forget about it. In effect, we'll be turning Western Australia into an island within an island, our own country.
No Premier has done more to undermine federalism and foster division than Mark McGowan, and all for political self-interest. There is no better example in Australia of a demagogue. Remember the assurances he gave when he first introduced a hard border?
Are working well. But it makes sense that we go further now and close the border. It won't be forever. It's a temporary closure to make sure we limit the spread of the virus in WA.
It's a temporary closure, and it's based solely on medical grounds, right?
The Premier's latest policy suggestion could invite controversy. Mark McGowan has hinted tight border restrictions could remain in place after the nation emerges from COVID-19.
I had a conversation with the Police Commissioner the other day about the impacts of the borders and how they have assisted in preventing the importation of meth.
The Premier has revealed there's another reason he's resisting calls to open our hard border to the east, and it's about your money, not your health. And the Premier didn't factor in those desperate to travel east to see loved ones, just tourism dollars.
The other states want us to open the border so that West Australian tourists will flood east, not so that people from the east will come here.
It's a real concern to the business community that there's a prospect that these border restrictions are not being based solely on health advice, but it's about economic protectionism.
Don't worry, West Australians. Dear Leader knows what's best for you and where you should spend your dollars. But even dear leaders look up to someone else. And guess who McGowan exalts and praises?
When Josh Frydenberg talks about the strength of our economy, what he's talking about is Western Australia and the fact we are a trading state that supports the nation. You don't support the nation unless you have customers, and our biggest customer is China.
I actually have a better relationship with China than I think the federal government does. The federal talk of conflict or trade retaliation can and must stop.
Let's call it for what it is. Mark McGowan is a lapdog to China.
A Sino-sycophant, you might say. And for being so loyal, he can be assured of getting his tummy tickled. As China's People's Daily Online loudly proclaimed in June, Australian state governor criticizes PM for attack on China.
And his need to control and influence public opinion is such, he even demands the arts industry promote the thoughts of Mark McGowan.
The group they are shutting out is the Australian Christian Lobby. The ACL have been prevented from booking the Albany Entertainment Centre or the Perth Concert Hall, both run by the Perth Theatre Trust, under a policy that declares it will not accept bookings where the content of the event does not represent the views of the West Australian Government or the vast majority of Western Australians.
As with all wannabe dictators, McGowan's outbursts and criticisms of other states, particularly New South Wales, are designed to distract from his own failings. This is what he doesn't want you to see.
For months now, serious concerns have been raised about the state of Western Australia's hospital system.
Perth's health system is at breaking point with a COVID
and its ability to cope with a COVID outbreak.
We have been delivering this ambulance service for this state for over 100 years, and we have never been in this sort of situation, and we've never been under this much pressure.
Remember, before this crisis, many believed that governments were there to serve us. They believed leaders would not exploit this crisis for electoral gain.
And they believed the immense and coercive powers governments give themselves would do no harm. And they believed their state premiers would forego political self-interest for the national good. What say you of those people, Mr. McGowan? Well, shortly we'll be crossing to Canberra to get the latest update on COVID from the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. But first, let's enjoy the wacky world of wackademia. Rita, have you got some wackademia for us?
Yes, I do. This is a good one. This is an academic from Melbourne, where else? Melbourne University has suggested the subject English should be renamed. It should be called something like language arts because its traditional name could be viewed as an act of assimilation, which would be terribly wrong. This is University of Melbourne senior lecturer Dr. Melita Hogarth, and she's called English the language of the oppressor. And she thinks that in the name of diversity, we should be calling it something like language arts instead. What do you think about that, Rowan?
Well, why do we, I mean, it's hilarious, but why do we fund these clowns? Why do my tax dollars, which I'd far rather go somewhere else, go to paying people to sit around in universities with this sort of rubbish? It's time that Alan Tudge, the education minister, started taking the money away. We'd see how long that, you'd see how long, James, that they didn't like English once they got a check, the checks stopped coming through. James, diversity has claimed a new victim.
I'm going to see Rita's language arts and raise her a diversity of thought here while we wait for the Prime Minister. At the University of North Carolina, they have appointed Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is the author of that execrable exercise in largely fraudulence called the 1619 Project, designed to say that the entire United States experience was all based on slavery. Well, the dean who made the appointment has now been revealed as saying that, and this is the dean of a journalism school, by the way, keep that in mind, journalism school, has said that diversity of thought would get in the way of the goal of racial equity. So racial equity, not equality of treatment, but equity of outcomes, this whole Marxist collectivist project that academia and the rest of society is going through right now is much more important than diversity of thought. So this is just saying that at a journalism school where they're going to turn out the people who tell Americans and the rest of the world what's going on in the world, don't think for yourself, just engage in the Marxist groupthink of equity and everything will be fine.
But Rita, doesn't this just bell the cat? Isn't she just absolutely been telling the truth? That in fact, if you twist it round, that social justice warriors and all this identity politics is incompatible with diversity of thought, i.e. democracy. In other words, it's neo-Marxism, correct?
It is. That's precisely what it is. That's what we should call it. And it's sinister. And, this woman won a Pulitzer, didn't she? Did she win a Pulitzer, James, for a widely discredited piece of work that was wrong, and not just a little bit wrong, but fundamentally wrong. And yet she's been awarded with this position, and the groupthink, you can just imagine the graduates that are going to come out of that university, what damage they're going to do once they're in the mainstream media.
Well, there we go. That was the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, talking live in Canberra, and what a bizarre and surreal press conference that was. We had two completely separate topics, James and Rita. The disconnect between the two. We had a military general standing there, and all it looks like he'd stepped out of A Few Good Men or something or other. He's talking about shutting businesses down, basically, and suppressing freedoms in Australia. Well, at the time, what he should be talking about is protecting the women and girls of Afghanistan, who the West has obviously clearly betrayed. And you could see from the moment Scott Morrison walked out there this morning, the ashen look on his face. Clearly, the intelligence coming in from Afghanistan is shocking and horrific. Girls will be sold into sex as sex slaves. They will be butchered. They will be killed. It is clear what is going on there is an absolute hellhole, and we have betrayed them. The West has betrayed them. And the Prime Minister says, oh, we've got no doubt about the character of the Taliban. Well, why the hell did we leave? Rita.
It's catastrophic what's happening there. The Prime Minister said it was highly volatile, dangerous. He said it was heartbreaking. He said Australians didn't die in vain. But yeah, that is a catastrophe. And then we had the vaccination message and thank you, Poland, 1 million extra doses of Pfizer coming Australia's way. So that's good news. But can I just point out some of what I thought were the bizarre comments from the Prime Minister? Firstly, this mantra that he's been repeating of late about lockdowns. And he said it again, for the lockdown to work, the lockdown must work. What?
Yeah.
The lockdown isn't working. Case numbers in New South Wales are increasing. He also urged Sydney-siders to stay at home. He said, and I quote, no need to be out for hours. And he also said, don't go to the beach for hours. Now, how many cases are occurring at the beach? New South Wales has been clear that they're not having outdoor transmission. Being outdoor in the fresh air, in the sun, in the water or on the sand, I would suggest is far safer than being in a supermarket or being indoors in any indoor setting. So this advice of stay at home, don't overdo your exercise at the beach, I just find that rather bizarre and not based on medical evidence.
James, your take on that strange press
conference?
Look,
I gotta back in what Rita just said there about, the medical advice. There's so much talk going on around about misinformation around the pandemic. Well, I think one of the biggest pieces of misinformation around the pandemic is that being outside is being dangerous. You see over and over again people going out, a lot of reporters like for the ABC going out trying to take pictures of people sitting in parks like somehow this is the most dangerous thing in the world to be doing. It's not. The problem is right now politically, Scott Morrison, Gladys Berejiklian, and leaders at all levels of government now, Dan Andrews as well, they're all gamblers chasing their losses on these lockdowns.
Yes.
The Victorian lockdown, as Rita has said, is going to keep going on and on, even though they did exactly what you're supposed to do, which is, short, sharp, hard, fast. It's not working anymore. Need a new strategy. If there is one bit of good news, and in about 20 minutes, Gladys Berejiklian is going to stand up and gravely announce the latest case numbers in New South Wales. But if you look at the Australian Department of Health website, it looks like the numbers of hospitalizations and ventilated patients is beginning to stabilize, just as it did in Britain when they started to experience a similar level of vaccination of the vulnerable, not the entire population. We've got a very high level of vaccination among the highly vulnerable, the elderly population now. That is starting to come through. That is really where we need to be thinking. Thinking just simply in terms of case numbers is not going to get us to the next phase. It's not going to change people's mentality.
Absolutely.
And it's going to keep giving people like Mark McGowan, Dan Andrews, Anastasia Palaszczuk, Stephen Marshall, and some of Gladys Berejiklian's cabinet and her police people the ammunition they need to keep this going on far longer than it needs to.
Well, the Prime Minister kept talking about vials of hope or packages of hope or whatever. Not many vials or packages of hope going to the girls and women of Afghanistan. Anyway, let's go now to Outsider's great friend, Army Horowitz, live in the States. Army, how are you, mate?
Oh, it's always a pleasure, guys.
Now, listen, before we get on to Andrew Cuomo, just give us your thoughts on the Afghanistan situation. How's it playing out in America?
Not well. It's not playing well for you when the New York Times on the front page has 2 articles excoriating you for your lack of leadership. No, this is going to come back. Look, we have so many problems in America that foreign policy is kind of pushed off to the side, to be honest. But this is a repeat, of course, of what we saw during the Obama time, where time after time he would not back his allies and would, in fact, back his enemies. We saw with Israel, we saw with Egypt, and now we're seeing with Afghanistan. It's an absolute shame, an absolute disgrace what we're doing there.
Rita.
It is a disgrace, but is Biden attempting to blame the previous administration for his administration's errors and really the errors of the past 20 years?
Yeah, he's trying to put blame wherever he possibly can, when in reality it's his own blunder. I mean, first of all, it is. And by the way, I want to be honest, there's a lot of blame to go around for years. The fact that we spent billions upon billions of dollars training the Afghan army, it's incredible to me how quickly they absolutely collapsed to the Taliban onslaught. It's really, it's shocking, really. And I think it points to the inability for us to nation build. I think this is what we really can take away from this, is that we're not really able to nation build. This is a small country, Afghanistan. We spent so much money, time, effort, blood, and treasure, and like that, it all went away. It's an incredible lesson, is the truth.
James.
But tell us what else is going on with the rest of the administration right now, because I'm hearing we've got all sorts of other problems out of the U.S. The southern border is collapsing. Inflation is rising, because who knew that pumping all of this money into the economy was going to wind up making consumer prices higher? Can you walk us through what this is meaning for people, ordinary Americans, now that they've got rid of Orange Man bad, and now they've got a Biden administration to deal with? What is this doing to people in their lives?
Yeah, it is not good, and it is looking bad. Despite all of the Herculean efforts by his allies in the media, it is clear that the American public has turned on Joe Biden, and his poll numbers are suffering. They are precipitously dropping, and they don't know what to do about it. They're trying to put whatever spin they possibly can. Fleeting inflation, they keep saying that. Or it's core producer price index. They start getting the minutia of inflation, saying it's not really inflation. But people aren't that dumb. People see right through it. And this is going to, first of all, in the short term, it's going to kill the Democrats in the midterm. And they have a much longer-term problem for the next in 3 years. Whether he decides to run again, which I'm not sure he will, frankly. Then they have the Kamala Harris problem, because nobody likes her, and she absolutely cannot win that election. So it's a whole host of problems across the board. Nothing's going right for these guys. Absolutely nothing.
Rita.
And we've got to touch on Hunter Biden. Apparently there's another laptop of his out there with dodgy business deals and drug-taking antics and prostitutes and God knows what else that is also lost. What's going on? How can one presidential son have so much bad luck with his laptops?
The sagest advice I ever heard was from human behaviorist Hugh Grant, when he said, I don't pay prostitutes to come over, I pay them to leave. This is a cardinal rule with prostitution that it seems to be that Hunter Biden simply cannot follow. I mean, the whole thing is incredible, but most incredible is after coitus, he's sitting there talking to her for like hours. And by the way, I didn't know you had to impress prostitutes. Is that why you pay them? I mean, sitting there telling stories and stories. And then on top of that, he's talking, okay, by the way, Joe Biden says that Hunter Biden is the smartest person he knows. That does not bode well for the people who work for him in his administration. He's one of the dumbest, he's dumber than a bag of rocks, okay? And he's sitting there, his big plan to make money was, I'm going to make a sex tape, and then I'm going to sell it to the media. That was his business model. It is unbelievable. This guy's allowed to run around. And then, of course, you have, I don't know if you guys want to talk about his artistry. By the way, it's not Hunter Biden. He's the artist formerly known as Shyster, right? I don't know.
That's
guys,
fantastic.
I give up.
Well, Army, the tragedy is, I suspect you are right. I suspect Hunter Biden probably is the smartest person that Joe Biden knows. And there you go. I'd love to talk Cuomo. We'll do that again very soon. Army, sorry we've got to rush through it, but thanks so much for coming on Outsiders today, and we'll speak soon.
Pleasure.
And coming up, well, the climate change IPCC report. Shiver me timbers, it's Ice Age Watch. Hello and welcome to Outsiders Weather and the Skeptics Ice Age Watch, where there was much excitement this week when the IPCC released their latest frenzy about global warming, or to put it in calm and cool-headed scientific terms, code red for humanity. Naturally, the world's and of course the Australian media went into a fever of climate change excitement with all sorts of headlines predicting all sorts of apocalyptic doomsdays scheduled for, well, sometime in the future if we don't act now. And to do so, we have to dismantle capitalism, by the way. Indeed, it was the Australian's Graham Lloyd, an apolitical reporter on climate change, who we have had on this show in the past, who was quick to point out that the IPCC's report was as much a political document as a scientific one, and, quote, that from a scientific perspective, the report does not draw any startling new conclusions. Rather, he wrote, the report is a vehicle for breathless prophecies of a looming Hadean future. And what will that future look like? Well, The Guardian opted for images of the floods in Germany this summer. Here are some cars stranded on das Autobahn. Ja, Scheiße. Not mentioning, of course, that Central Europe has a long history of such floods. Indeed, in the summer floods of 1910, there were over 1,200 deaths when the River Ahr flooded in Germany. Still, no doubt the flooded Autobahn pics scared the kiddies witless about what the future holds for them. Closer to home, the Financial Review used this photo to demonstrate the effects of catastrophic climate change getting worse in Australia, saying that coastal towns across Australia, including Byron Bay, have been hit by rising tides, washing away beaches in front of multi-million-dollar properties, and that residents at Collaroy on Sydney's northern beaches have had to pay for the construction of a 1.3-metre seawall to protect their homes at an average cost of $282,000 per resident. Scary stuff, unless, of course, you're a Northern Beaches wall builder. But, as any Sydneysider knows, this same stretch of beach, which sits coincidentally just north of Zali Steggall's electorate of Warringah, an Aboriginal word which means, as I'm sure Zali knows, rain, waves and sea, this stretch of beachfront from Collaroy to Narrabeen has always been hit by massive waves from the sea, often during times of heavy rain. We call it erosion, but the original inhabitants called it Warringah, rain, sea and waves. Here is Collaroy Beach in 1920, over 100 years ago, nothing to do with climate change, being hit by Warringah, sea, waves and rain. And here it is again in 1966, being hit by more Warringah, sea, waves and rain. And more recently, here is the famous shot from the same beachfront in 1978, when Zali Steggall was a young nipper, so she should remember it, being hit by, more Warringah, sea, waves and rain. And here we see a group of local firefighters helpfully putting out the sandbags at Collaroy Beach in 2016 to hold back the Warringah, the sea, waves and rain. And here we see them pretty much the exact same spot back in 1945, holding back the Warringah, the sea, waves and rain. The lesson to be taken from all of this is not to stop mining coal or to start pushing water uphill in Jindabyne, but rather, if you're going to live on Collaroy Beach, build a bloody wall. Perhaps jealous of all the attention the IPCC were getting, the climate-preaching National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, or NOAA, leapt into the fray, excitedly declaring that July was the hottest month ever recorded on Earth, according to the Daily Mail. Wow, big call. You know, I'm sure there was a pretty hot July when temperatures reached around 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit about 54 billion years ago. But anyway, according to the Conservative Woman website, a bit of diversity there for you on Ice Age Watch, according to Conservative Woman, the data shows July was not really all that extraordinary after all. They cite the Central England Temperature Series, the long-running, high-quality data set which has been carefully pieced together over many years, which reveals last month was only the 21st hottest July since records began in 1878, based on daily maximum temperatures. And according to this chart from the Global Temperature Report put out by the Earth System Science Center at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, showing monthly global troposphere anomalies from 1991 to 2021, global temperatures are no higher now than they were 20 years ago. The hottest July ever, or just more climate hype? After all, there's nothing hotter than July. Just ask Stevie. Now it's Weekly Wokely. James, go woke, go broke. You're not going to believe who it is this time.
I love this one as almost as much as I love my American Express card. American Express, the company that made $2.3 billion profit last year and which has its entire business model around the idea of privileges that accrue to you based on the color of your card, paid the great-grandson of the founder of Nation of Islam to come in to lecture its employees about, guess what? Their privilege, and get them to rank their privileges based on the color of their skin.
So Amex are going to go woke and go broke. I don't believe it. And what was that credit card? There's the gold one. There are different ones, aren't there? Aren't they racist as well?
Well, I mean, you got the platinum one, but actually the most coveted one is actually the black card. So there you go.
Rita, quickly.
Now, this is just insanity. The transgender head of one of Scotland's biggest rape crisis centres wants so-called bigoted rape survivors to be re-educated about transgender rights as part of their recovering process from their trauma. I mean, this is just utterly obscene. It's causing a huge uproar in Scotland and beyond. And this just shows you that nothing is sacred. Even women who have survived that sort of trauma have to be indoctrinated in this trans ideology.
Like we said, Rita, it's the war on women. Well, that's it for this week's Outsiders. Thank you so much for watching us. We will see you next Sunday at 9 a.m. Don't miss it. Up until then, that's all for this week. But up now is the latest news here on Sky News Australia. Thank you.